Orthodox paintings, you might see Jesus doing the same pose, essentially, well, the same hand gesture. Essentially, it's the little finger up, the ring finger touching the thumb like this, the middle finger slightly bent, and the index finger raised fully. Now, some people have speculated that this has some sort of connection to Buddhism, but it seems to be uniquely Christian because it sort of spells out ICXC, which is the old Greek initials for Jesus, so it's sort of like an early Christian gang sign, I guess. But in Catholic paintings you often see Jesus doing the sort of two-finger pose, the hand of benediction, as it's called. And there's a lot of theories behind why this gesture came about. Obviously there's things like, some people speculate it's the occult or something to do with palmistry, but let's skip past that because some people speculate that it's got something to do with Peter having an ulnar nerve injury. Now, Peter was the first pope, and people just copied it. So because he had this ulnar nerve injury, his hand would sort of involuntarily go into this position. However, this theory is pretty much unlikely, because to go into this position, he would have to try and make a fist, and this is unlikely if he was going to give a blessing to anybody. So the real reason why Jesus did this hand gesture probably comes from the ancient Romans and Greek. Now, the ancient Romans and Greeks had a list of hand gestures that they used during speeches to emphasize points and stuff like that, and if you want to look them up, it's called chironomania. And this hand gesture was more or less used by people who were about to speak or had the right to speak. And one famous example of this is an image of Rufius Probanius, who was a Roman deputy. Now, the Christ in Majesty pose developed over time, and I should say the Christ in Majesty pose is the sort of pose you always see Jesus doing in early medieval paintings. But he is nearly always, from very early on, doing this hand gesture, and it's easy to see why, because this hand gesture is synonymous, well, was synonymous with lawgivers and educators. But there is one exception when Jesus isn't doing this hand gesture, and that's when he's in judgment, and then his hands are out flat. Well, actually, the hand gesture may have developed a lot earlier on in the Roman period. For instance, if you look at this famous statue of Emperor Augustus, he's doing something quite similar, but he's not supposed to be giving out laws or educating anybody. He's supposed to be addressing the troops like that. But going back to hand gestures, Jews in the 1st century wouldn't have done any of these hand gestures when giving out blessings. They would have done something very similar to the Vulcan salute. This Vulcan salute style gesture is still used by the Jewish Kohanim, and it features in a lot of ancient images. And the reason they did this is because it looks like the Hebrew letter Shin, which stands for God Almighty. So, had Jesus been around, or whatever you believe, he would have done something very similar to the gesture found on Star Trek. But just to end off, going back to letters that represent Jesus, X has always been used to represent Jesus over the centuries. One famous example I'm sure you all know of is Xmas instead of Christmas. But when people sign a letter or a message with a kiss, that X is supposed to represent Jesus as well, and it was often sealed with a kiss afterwards. However, the O's, there's some theories about why the O's or the hugs came about, but nobody really knows for sure, so it remains a bit of a mystery.